Hi, welcome to another episode of The Leadership Enigma. You know I always get excited about each and every episode. Now I've got two teenagers and they think I'm a dinosaur and they think that I'm generally embarrassing, don't they? So this is, I think, going to be a fabulous episode when we think about multi-generational issues. Now, with all of these, I need someone far wiser than myself in answering some of these questions. So come back to me just after this break, where we will have the wonderful Rachele Focardi. So just come back to me.
You're listening to The Leadership Enigma, powered by Transform Performance International, a podcast for the insatiably curious to explore the power of human-centered leadership to create real momentum for positive and sustainable change. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts, and disruptors as we discover that success leaves clues. Now, here's your host, Adam Pacifico.
Well, there we go. There's never any pressure on me after that introduction, is there? But it's a massive welcome to Rachele Focardi for joining the Leadership Enigma. How are you?
Thank you so much, Adam. I'm doing great. Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to see you. Now, today is the day that I actually have to go to an airport for the first time, Rachele, in 21 months in order to go on a business trip. But I know that you're born in Italy. You're currently in Singapore. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. You're a global speaker and you are an author of Reframing Generational Stereotypes, and that is going to be the focus of our conversation. But just tell the listeners a little bit about you. What have I missed out?
Well, I mean, as you said, I'm from Italy. I have spent most of my professional life between Europe, the United States, and Asia for the last 10 years. I am a Gen X and a mother of 3 little kids who are 7, 4, and 2. And I have a passion for helping generations understand one another, particularly when it comes to the workforce. So looking now at all the kind of disruption and complexity our world is facing right now, how can we really leverage on the strength and power that each one of us can bring to the table to drive positive change? So after 20 years of supporting organizations with their employer branding efforts and adapting to the needs of the new generation, I'm very excited now to have the opportunity to help them get all these generations to work together and collaborate for a better future.
Now, I've been looking forward to this episode because this is a topic that is on a lot of people's minds. Certainly, you're going to be busy, aren't you, with children at 7, 4, and 2. I have memories of that age. Mine are just now teenagers, but that's a story for another episode, isn't it? But what got you really to start to really focus on these multi-generational issues? So how did you end up really writing your book and being really a thought leader in this space?
Well, you know, Adam, that's a really good question. And I think, the seeds of the things that end up becoming our passions are always planted, much earlier than we even realize. But I think for me, the passion when it comes to, harmonizing the multi-generational workforce actually was planted when I was a young student myself, when I graduated from college. And I decided to move back to Italy. I was studying in the United States and, coming out of an American university with all the ambition and the drive and the desire to make a difference and prove myself, I ended up working for an advertising agency in the United States and in Italy, actually. And that is where I learned about the pretty sad and depressing reality that I think many young talented individuals were facing back in the day, because of course back then workplace was very different and young people were seen as not having really much to contribute to or much that was worth saying or hearing. And so I came in with all this ambition and all this drive, and it was just I find myself facing the harsh reality that as a young person I was really not valuable to anybody around me, and that was really frustrating. So this is really what actually planted the seed for me many years ago, and then of course it evolved over the years.
And it's funny because I remember, being a young lawyer. Now, this is a long time ago. Rachele, it's too long ago for me to really remember. But I remember, I came through a traditional industry, and there was always that, if you were new, then you would be pretty much silent, and you would stay put, and you would wait almost to be invited into the conversation. And you talked about some of the frustrations that you faced as well. One of the challenges that I know you and I spoke about when we chatted a few weeks ago was that there's going to be 5 generations working together. Is that correct? 5?
Absolutely, absolutely. We now have, for the first time in history, 5 generations that are going to be working alongside each other. Obviously, we all know about baby boomers, which are working well past the age of retirement, but we still have a lot of traditionalists, the generation that came before the baby boomers, people in their 70s who are still in the workplace and going strong. Yeah. And then, of course, you have my generation, Gen X, smallest generation in history, millennials.
Yes.
Who are now well in their 30s. And then, of course, you have the incredible Generation Z, who are really ultimately the ones that inspired me to write my book. But they're definitely on their way into the workforce, and they want to drive big changes. And I think it's going to be important for us to listen to them and support them in driving those changes.
So help me frame some of the challenges then. If we're going to have 5 generations, I think you said for the first time ever, in the workplace, what are some of the things, high level to start with, that leaders and organizations need to start to think about at least?
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the biggest challenges as we have 5 generations working alongside each other is the difference in mindsets, in behavior, in approach to hierarchy, to technology, to communication. And so what happens is, even though diversity is great, and we've seen now, and we know over the years, it's been proven time and time again that diversity actually creates stronger teams. If not handled with care, it creates a volatile environment, which leads to obstacle in communication and conflicting expectations. And unfortunately, this is very much what is happening right now. I think at the bottom of it is the ever-ending, dilemma between or fight or struggle between, traditional thinking and new age mindset. And we see it very much in the workplace right now, with the new generations wanting to drive change, and this feeling that the older generations are resistant to that change and prefer to do things the old way. And what happens is this creates a series of inevitable intergenerational conflicts in the workplace that actually prevent organizations from really being able to unleash the full power of their human capital. And most people, Adam, don't talk about it. It's very rare for employees to go to their managers, even as they leave organizations, and say, I'm leaving because of intergenerational conflicts, because I think that we just don't align in terms of behaviors, expectations, and so on and so forth. But I've worked with thousands of companies over the year, and every time that I do internal studies with employees, one of the top 2 reasons why particularly young people leave companies are actually intergenerational struggles. So this is actually quite a strong reality, and many organizations now are facing this XYZ divide syndrome, right? I like to call it, where generational diversity is seen as a negative element, which actually makes the workplace less productive as opposed to more productive. And that's really a shame.
Now, Rachele, what I'm hearing is there is a fine balance for leaders in their organizations, that obviously it's a great benefit to have the huge diversity of thought. But you're also talking about that if we don't actually think about that diversity and about how the generations work together, it can also go horribly wrong. So what I'm hearing is the balance. And one of the things, I was feverishly writing things down as you just spoke then, Rachele, and you talked about mindsets and behaviors, and I think we're going to talk about how do those generations communicate as well. Tell me a little bit about some of the differences that you're seeing in your research as regards mindset, because you mentioned traditional and new age, and that in itself is an interesting term. But what are some of the differences in mindset? Let's start there.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good question. One thing that I think is important to highlight is I don't think, aside from the 5 generations working together, there's so many things about this particular time in history that have been common throughout history, right? It's the ever-ending dilemma between the older and the newer, right?
That's right.
George Orwell actually shared something really interesting, which says every generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that comes before it and wiser than the one that comes after it. So, it's a never-ending struggle, and it's nothing new. But I think what's different now, and something that actually the millennials really facilitated in the workplace and forced the entire world to understand, is that young people matter. right? Young people have important things to say. They can contribute. They can build great companies. They can do great things. And I think this is the big difference between my generation and the generations prior, from Gen X and earlier, and from millennials later, right? It's this idea that, I'm not a rookie who's an empty container that needs to be indoctrinated. I have somebody who understands the world, who's the most in touch with my own times, who has things to say and has ideas, and I can contribute, right? And so this is where you see the struggle, because in the past, it was still there. I felt that way. It's just that I couldn't voice it out. And in fact, when I was young and I felt, the need to contribute, and I went to my boss and I said, please let me be part of an internal meeting. I'll be a fly on the wall. I just want to listen in and learn something from the accounts team and how they talk to the creative team. And I was actually called in by HR, Adam. I was told that I was overstepping my boundaries. That was not my place. Ambition was not going to be rewarded, that type of ambition at least, and that I had to, keep my head low and do what I was supposed to do, which was mostly, make coffees and serve coffee and do very menial tasks.
I'm thinking you probably didn't stay at that organization for very long, Rachele.
No, you know what? I didn't buy it. And it was interesting, Adam, because actually I felt so frustrated after this happened to me.
I bet.
And I remember I called my grandfather in Italy, and he was a lawyer and a traditionalist and still going strong. And I complained to him. I said, I have this great degree and I want to be able to learn something, and I'm not learning anything. And I expected empathy. And instead he got really mad at me. He said, well, what do you expect? You just started. You're still paying your dues. You need to keep your head low and you need to, follow the rules. And maybe one day, in 10 years or so, when you followed enough leaders around to be able to repeat some of what you've learned, then we can talk. And I didn't buy it, Adam. Needless to say, I left that organization and I moved on. But that was very much the reality. And so I think the challenge that organizations have today is that these new generations, they don't want to be censored. They don't want to be told that they can't contribute. They know that they have a lot to bring to the table, and they want to be able to create the most amount of impact in the shortest period of time. And on the other hand, of course, you have a workplace that up until recently wasn't used to this approach, right? So if you think about some of the current leaders, leaders weren't expected to be nice. That wasn't part of the job description up to a few years ago. I remember a quote from that 70s show where Red Foreman tells his 16-year-old son, who just got a job after school in the 70s to pay for his education, that work is not supposed to be fun. It's about, seeing how much crap you can take from the boss man and then taking some more. And so that was the reality of the workplace until, the millennials showed up. And then the millennials came in and expected things to be different. And so right now you still have a little bit of friction internally. And the reason for that is that when millennials came into the workforce and decided that work was supposed to be more than just a living, it was supposed to be, part of who they were, and they wanted to be able to contribute and work in a friendly environment that valued it for their diversity. Organizations were struggling to win this war for talent that McKinsey had talked about as a strategic imperative. And so whether they were JP Morgans, whether they were banks, whether they were traditional industries, they all started to change to give millennials a lot more voice and a lot more flexibility. But what they failed to do was to educate the employees that were currently in the workforce who didn't have that much, that much room to express themselves or flexibility when they were the millennials' age, why these changes were necessary. Right. All of a sudden, these leaders were told, you need to become the perfect leader, the perfect coach. You need to give them work-life balance. You need to make sure that they're trained and motivated, and then they stay. And so this created a little bit of a friction, because in some ways, the new generations were kind of shoved down people's throats. And unfortunately, that created a rift that is still very much there. So I wrote my book exactly in hope that generations can start to understand one another, understand how different the contexts are that shape them, and can finally start to have a dialogue that will help them understand how much stronger they are together as opposed to, not together.
So Rachele, I've got a question for you. Was it the millennials that essentially were the tipping point for people to start to really understand that there was a multi-generational issue? Because I think, I love my football, my soccer, and most of the players there are always very young. If I think about technology, a lot of those founders of now huge iconic organizations are very young. So was it that the millennials were the tipping point because there was a critical mass that really started to raise this issue as important?
Yeah, the millennials were the tipping point. And this is
Right.
why I think we all owe so much to this generation, because they're the ones that drove this workplace revolution that we're all benefiting from. I mean, if you think about it, the workplace today is very different from what it was 15 years ago. And we owe this to the millennials. I think what changed in the case of this generation is, I mean, of course, as a Gen Xer, I remember very much the disappointment of the dot-com crash and, all of that really kind of killed the morale. But I think as millennials started to rise out of university, they started to realize that work was supposed to be more than just suffering. And I think, 2008 was a really big tipping point, because as the global economy, experienced, what we all know it has experienced, while many people thought that would kind of throw millennials off their high horse, it actually reinforced their idea that I need to live while I'm living. I mean, these are kids that saw their parents, divorced in many cases because mom or dad were never around and they didn't have time to communicate, that watched their parents give up on their dreams because they didn't have enough vacation days to visit all the places they wanted to visit and kept putting it off to retirement. Many of them witnessed their parents, become old and gray, working in a cubicle or in a job that didn't give them any excitement and didn't make them feel like they were doing anything meaningful. And then all of a sudden 2008 happened and many parents just lost their job. Many of them lost all their retirements. So all of a sudden, all these dreams that kept being pushed off, could never happen. And so I think this is when millennials woke up and said, you know what, enough is enough. Life needs to happen while it happens. I want to live experiences while I'm alive. And I want to work with organizations where I can do things that make me feel good, that appreciate me for my diversity. And in fact, they were the ones that, made issues that were previously taboo, like mental health or sexual orientation or many other, they normalized them in this effort to say, you know what, I want to work for a company that values me for exactly who I am and through which I can do something that is going to make me happy and allow me to have the lifestyle that I want. So they were absolutely the tipping point, and they forced people to recognize that young people matter. And I think this is where they're very strong and we owe them a lot.
Now, Rachele, as I listen to you describe that, it sounds like there's an energy and a disruptive nature to, this population coming through the workforce. I also start to think, what do my 15 and 18-year-old really think about what they want to do with their lives? But again, that's a story for another episode. I've got to ask the question about the impact of COVID on the work that you're doing and the research that you're carrying out. So what's COVID done, for better or worse, do you think, with this dynamic of the multi-generational workforce?
Well, I think, and I'm an optimist by nature here, Adam.
Me too.
So I don't want to, in any way sound insensitive or not recognize all the trauma, the pain, and the devastation that COVID has brought by and will continue probably to bring by for years to come. But, if we want to see opportunity in crisis, I think from a multi-generational workforce perspective, COVID was a great thing because it kind of leveled the playing field. If we think about it, all of a sudden it forced all generations to live pretty much the same experience, especially in the workplace. It forced, for example, the older generations, even the ones who were the most resistant to technology, they had to embrace technology and tech tools all of a sudden, in order to continue to remain productive members of society. And this, of course, has, bridged the gap between them and millennials. I think another thing that's extremely important to note is the fact that for many older generations, me included, being authentic was something that we were advised not to do, right? So we were always the ones coming in the workplace, looking professional, acting professional. And I think at the beginning of a pandemic, you could see the generational difference just by looking at the background in Zoom calls, right? The, Gen Xers, baby boomers and beyond, had the, as you can see here, perfectly crafted, background. Looking professional, or that, empty wall, while the millennials and then Gen Zers were the ones more comfortable walking around the house while they went to the kitchen and grabbed themselves a glass of water and all of that. And I think, this was a very big divider. But over time, you started seeing the older generations getting more comfortable and showing themselves in their own environment and getting rid of that virtual background and wearing T-shirts. And so this kind of made the older generations appear a lot more relatable to the newer generations, who all of a sudden could see, past the boss, past the leader, into their house, into their world. And then, of course, many other things. I think from a societal perspective, and of course, this translates into every business. I think what COVID forced everybody to realize is that the challenges that we are facing as a society, and then, of course, as businesses, cannot be solved through the traditional and hierarchical way of doing business. The only way to be able to turn this kind of humanitarian crisis into an opportunity is actually for the young generations to work hand in hand with the older generations and solve many of these interconnected challenges that we're inevitably going to be facing going forward. And so all of a sudden, organizations realize that if we're going to move forward into the future, we need to kind of be able to leverage on all the strengths and expertise and skill sets of the different generations and get them to work together for the betterment of the organization or of society. And this is a big change. And this is leading to a lot more collaborative decision making as opposed to hierarchical decision making, even when it comes to very, very senior leaders and interns, or in the case of shadow boards, the executive board, being injected with,
I'm going to come on to that.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like COVID then was a calibrator for many people, as you've just described. And for organizations that get this right, there's a real win in it. And there will be some organizations who get this wrong. And there's obviously some detrimental impact as well. I'm getting that from what you're telling me. I want to ask a question about how they communicate. How do these generations communicate? Or what are you seeing in your work where they're finding the right way for these generations to communicate? And then I want to move on to something that, because you said shadow boards, and I know we talked about that when we first, and I want to understand that, because I think there's going to be a number of listeners who say, what do you mean by shadow boards? So let me just split that. Otherwise, I'm asking double questions. Communication. What are kind of the main points that you're seeing in those that are getting it right in managing the communication between the levels? Because I'm assuming, if I'm thinking of the younger generation, they like to communicate in perhaps a different way than the older generation are used to communicating. What are you seeing in your work?
Well, this is the thing, Adam. I don't think that it's about forcing generations to communicate in ways that they're not naturally comfortable with.
Okay.
I think the struggle is not in finding a common way where everybody communicates in the same way. I think that the number one challenge and opportunity here is just making sure that people understand one another. Because, the interesting thing about it is that when I actually ask talent, and as I was writing my book, Reframing Generational Stereotypes, I surveyed thousands of employees across all types of organizations globally. And 97% of them, when I asked them, how much do you think you know about the context and the forces that shaped your multi-generational colleagues, 90% say they know nothing at all.
Wow.
Or extremely little. So what happens is the problem is not in people's behaviors, mindsets, and even communication styles. The problem is in how we interpret those. And if I don't know much about you and I don't understand you as an older generation, when you're sitting in front of me and I'm talking to you and you're texting, I see that as a lack of respect. Now, if I understood a little bit more about your generation and your culture and how you've been brought up, I probably wouldn't experience it the same way. So I think one of the biggest challenges for organizations is to make sure that people understand one another. Cross-generational awareness sessions are so important. And that's why even in my book, for example, I took people back in time to understand a day in the life of a young boomer when they entered the workforce. What did the office look like? How many years could they expect to go by before they got a significant promotion or raise? Were they allowed to speak up? What was their relationship with their boss? What did leadership look like? What were behavioral norms? And, I think when people understand that about one another, it's very easy then to drop that confirmation bias and say, okay, now I understand that behavior stems from something different. So I can give you a quick personal story. But for example, when I was growing up, when I entered the workforce, my father said, listen, sit here. I need to teach you the golden lesson that you're going to carry throughout your entire life. Remember, never trust anybody at work. Never befriend anybody. Nobody's ever your friend. Everybody at the end of the day is after that same promotion, that same job, that same role, the favors of their bosses, that same assignment. So remember, never be authentic. Never share anything personal. Keep the personal and the professional extremely separate, because the second you leave the window of opportunity, they'll stab you. And that friendship with your boss, it's not going to save you from losing your job if you ever, are not useful anymore, and so on and so forth. So of course, as I entered the workplace, I always kept a little bit of a distance between me and my colleagues. And when the young generation started coming and working with me, when I was working with my previous employer, they had all these get-togethers after work, and I was really uncomfortable. And when I was there, I was a bit stiff, I'm not gonna lie. And the confirmation bias, of course, was, look at Rachel, look at the Gen Xer. She thinks she's more important, she's self-important, she thinks she's better than us, she doesn't know how to be authentic, and so on. In reality, if they knew that I was secretly terrified, because I just didn't know where the line was, where is the point of no turning back? Is it okay for me to be me and then still be this person's boss or colleague during the day? So I think understanding one another really helps us be a lot more lenient and understanding of other people's behaviors. And as a result, it doesn't then require us to change the way we communicate, but just to understand that, hey, if the millennial communicates like that, it's not because they're treating me with lack of respect, or they don't respect my opinion. And likewise, the old generations, if they, raise an eyebrow when I talk about my promotion 6 months after the previous one, it's not because they don't want to see me grow, it's because they're just not used to it. And one thing that I think is important, and particularly in some regions, for example, Adam, is the concept of respect. So one of the top issues in the workplace, or one of the biggest contributors to intergenerational conflicts, is lack of respect.
Or perceived.
The young generations think the old generations don't respect them. And then when you see the old generations, they think the young generations don't respect them. And so I decided to dive deep into this and find out, what do people mean by respect? Because everybody feels disrespected. Okay. And so when I was talking to the baby boomers, they expect deference and more weight given to their opinion. And this, if you think about it, really comes from their, the way their parenting style that they experienced growing up. I mean, the father was a scary figure. He was the one that would punish you for your own good. You had to kind of be careful around him. You always had this reverential fear. So of course, as they enter the workplace and encounter people like their father, they felt in a similar way and they interacted in a similar way. Millennials, they don't know that. The young generations have very open relationship with their parents. So when they join the workforce and they come up to you and they tell you straight to your face that your idea is a bit out of date, or that they would do it differently, to them, that is respect. Millennials tell me, to me, that is respect, because it shows that I respect you enough to tell you things the way I see them, without beating it around the bush, without playing politics, without wasting time. I trust you enough to be honest with you. And they see that as a form of respect, while the older generations see that as disrespect. So very often, again, the key is really just understanding one another. And that's already half of the problem solved.
I think that's a fascinating point, that it's about understanding. And I think a lot of leaders are going to find themselves feeling uncomfortable as they increase their understanding, as you say, of the multi-generations. Do you know what? I remember having my then was a 16-year-old daughter in the car with some of her friends, and I thought, they're all on the phone, and they're all on the phone and not talking to each other. And I thought, that's really weird. And I actually said to them, it's not very nice, is it? You'd all, why are you not talking to each other? And I actually learned, because they told me that actually they were all on their phone because they were texting with the girls in the car behind as well. So actually what they were doing was including everybody, as opposed to just sitting there in silence and doing their own thing. I had to learn, I had to understand that is. So it is fascinating in that respect. And again, that word respect, if leaders pause and think, hang on, what is going on here? As opposed to maybe jumping to a conclusion, that's perhaps good advice as well. Now, you mentioned shadow boards. So because you mentioned it, help us understand, what do you mean by shadow boards, or using multi-generational people within a shadow board?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the direction that organizations are taking is moving away from this hierarchical model and move into what was called collaborative decision making.
Right.
So where basically everybody collaborates, everybody works together on a project, and everybody contributes and injects their ideas and perspectives. Now, a lot of organizations, or some actually, not a lot yet, unfortunately, have taken this to the next level by saying, you know what, if we think about it, as an organization, right? We need to continue to evolve. But to evolve, we need to understand our customer base. We need to, which often are the new generations out there. But the reality is that if we look at the people who make the decisions, they're usually, if we look at the executive boards or the executive teams, these are usually people that belong to the older generations. And so while they have, a plethora of experience and understanding and knowledge of the industry, they do not have, obviously, the understanding of young consumers, of new communication channels, and so on and so forth. And so all of a sudden, and I can give you a great example,
yes,
Group N,
please.
the media, the advertising conglomerate. But I mean, it was amazing because they said, we realized that in our industry, it was so important to be in touch with young consumers. And, again, as I mentioned, unfortunately, in order to be able to get that feedback, there is so many layers, right? Because if the executive board needs to get that feedback from the young interns, there's so many different layers, so many bottlenecks. It's not that easy to get that input. And then we also faced a second challenge, they said. The challenge is that we want to bring in people and we want to prepare them for leadership. And we know that the best people out there are going to want to have that exposure to leadership. And as I said, are going to want to drive an immense amount of impact in a very short time. So what they decided to do is to create a program, which is called the WICO program, where they identified young talent that had been in the company for about a year. And they basically created a youth committee, a committee of young people that actually shadowed and accompanied the biggest strategic decisions that were made by the executive committee. So what happened is this allowed the organization to inject fresh perspectives and cover any blind spot in decision making. So if there was a project of strategic importance to the business, the executive committee would involve the youth committee, and the youth committee would be the ones responsible for, understanding the market, driving the initiative, launching it, and so on and so forth. But furthermore, they realized that actually there is so much that can be learned from different generations. And so on top of this a youth committee working on projects of strategic importance, they also started reverse mentoring the executive committee. So every executive committee member had 2 WICOs who were at any given point mentoring them on different topics, which could be how to build your social media profile, or e-commerce in India, or Bitcoins, or whatever, or even, things related to new age thinking, or how to actually, have work-life balance, how to care about the environment and do something about it. So a lot of different topics depending on the level of interest of the EXO. And this turned out to be an incredible initiative because the organizations was able to launch incredible programs. One of them was actually an upskilling program that was driven by the WICO that drove incredible transformation within the business. But also they realized that there was so much that the young generations could teach the older generation, and all this benefited not only the organization, but from a perspective of, we're more in touch with the times, but also the organizations in terms of being able to prepare young generations for leadership by exposing them to the executive committee. So this is really an example of how organizations are taking this multi-generational, intergenerational collaboration aspect really seriously by saying we need both. Equally able to contribute with their knowledge, with their understanding, and so on forward, to be able to make decisions that will make us successful going forward. And of course, not every company has a shadow board. It requires a lot of commitment, of course,
and
but
courage.
there's many things that companies can do on a smaller scale to achieve similar results.
Okay, well, I love that as an idea to actually have that youth committee. And I think there's some courage in that. I think, getting that diversity of thought, and it's being vulnerable in some ways, because the best ideas may actually come from the youngest as opposed to the most experienced. So I think I interrupt you slightly because we can't solve all the problems on these episodes, but I think what we do is we spike people's interest, and we can always help leaders start their journey. So you've just talked about the youth committee, which I think is a fabulous idea. I really do. It's something that I want to look at in my organization. But what advice would you have for leaders of small, medium, large organizations who are thinking, I'm leading an organization where this is a reality. I have multi-generational workforces to look after. What are 2 or 3 things that you think they should start to think about or action in order to be that progressive leader? What's front of mind for you?
Okay, well, front of mind is for one, to understand that this is a reality.
Yeah.
Generational diversity is diversity. Intergenerational conflicts are very real, and they're fundamentally caused by a profound lack of knowledge and understanding that we have of one another. And, the interesting thing also in my studies, Adam, is that, 90+% of employees on average across age groups say that generational diversity is extremely important and should be top of mind for most for their organizations. Yet only 23% of HR professionals say that their organization is committed to it. And likewise, there was a recent research study by Deloitte that said that 70% of organizations recognize the challenges of multi-generational workforce as key over the next 1 to 2 years, but only 10% are ready to address this change. And so I went out and started finding out, why is it that companies are so reluctant to do that? And one thing is that HR professionals and business leaders are often terrified, are often worried about bringing this topic up. Are we going to offend someone? Are we going to, sound politically incorrect? Are we going to be able to make everybody feel equally included? And so on and so forth. I worked with certain organizations that even told me, Rachel, come in and please do one of your cross-generational awareness sessions, but try not to use the word older or younger when you refer to generation. And to be honest, I was a little baffled because, Earth is based on time. Things are either younger or older, and it doesn't have to be a good thing or a bad thing. It's just, everything comes with its strengths. So I think business leaders need to, take their head out of the sand, and whether they want to believe in what's often mentioned nowadays. I just saw recently an article on the New Yorker saying it's time to remove all generational labels. Everybody's the same. Generations don't exist. This notion, even though I'm sure it means well, actually, in my opinion, makes things worse, because the experience that people are feeling, as, a particular generation in the workplace in relations to their peers is very real. And so being able as a business leader to say, let's address this. Let's let our workforce understand why it's more important than ever that all generations work together. Let's help them understand one another. And then let's create an opportunity for the different generations to see the world through each other's eyes. So whether it's starting with, cross-generational awareness sessions where everybody can see the workplace through each other's eyes, to multi-generational panels, where you have different generations on a panel and the organization asking questions and seeing the perspective from different angles, to the opportunity to interact inside and outside of work in a way that helps people understand each other better, but also learning from one another. 96% of employees out there say that they're dying to learn from each other, but organizations don't provide that opportunity unless it's in a very, very formal manner. But equally, baby boomers, traditionalists, and Gen X, and millennials and Gen Z, they say they want to learn from one another. And they were very specific. And I mentioned a lot of this in my book about what exactly they do want to learn from one another. So for example, two-way mentoring is fantastic. Giving employees the opportunity to be both mentor and mentee, learning something while at the same time feeling that they're imparting knowledge and helping the new generation shape the future. That's key. And the final thing, I think, there's many, obviously, and I share all of these in great detail in my book. But one thing that works incredibly well, as I said, is collaborative decision-making.
Right.
Create small teams. It doesn't have to be a shadow board, but, create a project team, strip everybody of seniority, help people understand one another, align them behind a shared vision, reward joint success, and then give them an opportunity to collaborate and work together based on expertise and not years of experience. And you will find that when the older generations realize that the young generations come up with very simple solutions, use technology very effective, and at the same time, the older generations are great and understanding how to navigate the organization and remove roadblocks. Once generations start to work together and collaborate based on what they're best at, and then they can see that that's moving everybody in the same direction of success, then it's going to be very, very rare, very unlikely that these teams are want to go back to the old way of working. And I think showing this as a result to the organization and say, look at the innovation that we were able to drive at record speed by really helping people understand one another and then collaborate in a way that really takes out what is best out of them, but also in a way that makes everybody feels valuable, equally able to contribute, equally important. And look what we've been able to do. I think it's going to be more and more likely the organization are going to embrace this type of approach. And they can see innovation, happen, at record speed once they do that.
So
and
this
also
episode,
engagement and satisfaction and all that.
Right. Okay. Understood. So this episode is packed full of wisdom and learning, which is fabulous. A question for you is, how do listeners get in contact with you if they want to continue the conversation and learn more?
Absolutely. I would be happy to talk more about this. It's such an important topic. I'm very, very present on social media. I am very active on LinkedIn. I can also be contacted through my website, XYZ at Work, XYZ at Work. And then, of course, if any of your listeners have any questions about, any of what I've discussed, or even want to have more tactical recommendations on what exactly to do to be able to foster a culture of intergenerational collaboration, of course, they can find everything.
Yes, hold up the book. We want to see the book, because this is also useful for the new YouTube channel that we'll have for the podcast as well. So tell us a little bit about the book as you're holding it up.
Yeah. So, this is a book where I really poured my passion in. It's based on 20 years of experience, and it really reads more like a novel. I share a lot of my own personal experience over the year, both my own and working with 2,000 companies. I interviewed baby boomers, millennials, Gen Zers. So it's really their stories that are reflected here. And then, of course, there's tons of companies that do fantastic things, from HSBC to Citi to Unilever to Group M to P&G and so on and so forth, who have shared first account best practices with me. So, there's a lot in here. It's not a very long read, but it goes quite fast. And I think it will help us. My ambition is that as we read it, we'll be able to help look and see one another through different eyes.
This is brilliant. Look, Rachele, thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's much later in Singapore than it is in London. You've been an absolute superstar for sharing all of this wisdom with us. I'm looking forward to this episode being released. I just want to say a massive thank you for being a great guest on the Leadership Enigma.
Thank you so much, Adam. I love your podcast. So thanks for having me.
Take great care.
Join us again next week for more tips and strategies on the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with your host on LinkedIn or visit the dedicated website, www.leadersenigma.com, powered by Transform Performance International, where you can access our exclusive learning, including books, videos, bonus content, assessments, and more. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.